On the night of March 11, 1989, the streets of Matamoros, Mexico pulsed with energy. Among them was Mark James Kilroy, a senior at the University of Texas at Austin, celebrating the break with his childhood friends. They had come from different colleges: Bill Huddleston and Bradley Moore from Texas A&M, Brent Martin from Alvin Community College, but they were bound by years of friendship and the promise of an unforgettable trip. That night, as they made their way back to the U.S. border, everything seemed fine. Then Mark disappeared. It happened in an instant. The group had stopped briefly for a restroom break. Huddleston, half distracted by the night's events, noticed a man, Hispanic, a scar on his face, motioning toward Mark. He heard Mark say something like, "Didn't I just see you somewhere?" At the time, it didn't seem alarming. Maybe Mark had run into someone he met earlier that night. When Huddleston returned to the group, Mark was gone. They assumed the obvious. He had caught a ride back, met someone, or wandered off. But as the sun rose and Mark's hotel bed remained empty, panic set in. Calls to hospitals, jails, anywhere he could have ended up, nothing. The police didn't seem alarmed at first. Another drunk college kid lost in the chaos of spring break. But as the days passed and Mark remained missing, reality set in. Something was wrong. Mark's parents, James and Helen Kilroy, flew to Brownsville, Texas, launching a desperate search for their son. They flooded the city with over 20,000 flyers, pleading for information. A $15,500 reward was offered, but no real leads emerged. On March 26th, America's Most Wanted aired his case, pushing his story into the national spotlight. Still, silence. He had vanished without a trace. Then, something cracked. In early April, a small-time drug smuggler, Elio Hernandez Rivera, was stopped at a police roadblock in Matamoros. A routine arrest for marijuana possession, nothing unusual. But under questioning, he spoke of something far more sinister. He mentioned a place, the Santa Elena Ranch. The police, desperate for any break in Mark's case, decided to investigate. On April 11th, Mexican federal police stormed the ranch, the dry heat suffocating as they stepped onto the cursed soil. The first thing they noticed was the smell, thick, putrid, unmistakable. A shack stood nearby, a silent witness to whatever horrors had unfolded inside. As they stepped closer, the earth beneath them told its own tale. Graves, shallow, hastily dug, scattered across the property. They started digging. Body after body surfaced, twisted and dismembered. The remarkable fates. When they showed the ranch caretaker a photograph of Mark, the man pointed to the shack. That was where they had taken him. It was not just a crime scene, it was a slaughterhouse. Mark Kilroy had suffered unimaginably. The cult that operated here believed in sacrifice, a twisted ritual meant to grant them invincibility. Their leader, Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, had demanded the offering of an Anglo college student. Mark had been chosen at random. He had tried to escape, breaking free for a brief moment, running toward the edge of the ranch. But they had caught him, dragged him back, bound and gagged him inside that shack. They had told him he would not be harmed. 12 hours later, Constanzo took a machete and brought it down on Mark's neck. His legs were severed at the knees. His brain and spine removed, fed into the ritual cauldron like a gruesome tribute to their false gods. The discovery sent shockwaves through Mexico and the United States. The press swarmed the ranch, exposing the nightmare that had unfolded just miles from the Texas border. The killings were not isolated. The cult had been slaughtering people for months. 15 victims in total, their bodies mutilated and discarded like offerings to the abyss. Mark's parents returned home without their son, their grief now entangled with the cause. They founded an anti-drug nonprofit in his name, hoping to prevent others from falling into the same darkness. "We put our energy into the fight against drugs," James Kilroy later said. "We try to look forward, not back." But the horror wasn't over. 2 weeks after the mass grave was uncovered, the shack was burned to the ground, a wooden cross planted over the site. The search for Constanzo and his accomplice, Sarah Aldrati, intensified. On May 6th, police tracked him to an apartment in Mexico City. As officers closed in, Constanzo panicked. He began throwing money out the window, screaming, firing his gun wildly. Then, in his final act of control, he turned to his most loyal follower, Alvaro de Leon Valdez, and ordered him to do the unthinkable, kill him. When the police finally stormed the apartment, they found Constanzo and one of his men lying lifeless, executed on their own command. Nearby, black candles flickered, their wax dripping over eerie relics, swords, a blindfolded doll, the remnants of his sick devotion. The mastermind was dead, but his cult lived on. Sarah Aldrete and the remaining members were captured, charged with murder and other heinous crimes. And yet, there was no justice that could undo what had been done, no law that could erase the terror that had lurked just beyond the border, hidden in the shadows of the party streets where Mark had once laughed with his friends. Nearly half a century ago, what was meant to be a peaceful family hike in northern Stevens County turned into a nightmare. Bobby Panknan, a young boy full of life and curiosity, vanished near Deep Lake Resort, leaving his family trapped in an endless cycle of grief and unanswered questions. It was a simple outing. Bobby, his brothers Jim and Bill, and their mother Edna set off down a rugged logging road. The sound of a nearby creek piqued Bill's curiosity, and Edna, ever the cautious mother, decided to accompany him. She told Jim to stay with Bobby on the road, a seemingly safe decision, but fate had other plans. For reasons unknown, Jim soon followed after them, leaving Bobby alone. It was only for a few minutes, but when Bill and Edna returned, expecting to find both boys waiting, there was only silence. Bobby was gone. At first, they thought he had simply wandered off, but as their calls went unanswered and the minutes stretched unbearably long, fear took hold. They searched desperately, combing the trees, scanning every inch of the road. But Bobby had vanished, as if the forest had swallowed him whole. As hours turned to days and days into weeks, no trace of him was found. The search expanded, drawing in law enforcement, volunteers, and search dogs. The lake was dredged. The woods were scoured. But despite their efforts, there were no footprints, no torn clothing, nothing. Bobby had simply disappeared. With no leads, theories swirled. Had he wandered too far and succumbed to the elements? Had he been attacked by a wild animal? Or, the most chilling possibility, had someone taken him? Bobby's father, Howard Panknan, was fishing with his eldest son, Ted, when he heard the news. He rushed back, desperate to find his missing child. But no matter how hard he searched, Bobby remained elusive. As the years passed, grief morphed into guilt. Edna, despite her deep love for her children, became an unfair target for blame. Whispers followed her. Why had she left Bobby alone? The burden of these accusations weighed heavily on her, adding to her heartbreak. Jim, too, carried the weight of regret. He often wondered if he should have stayed. Could he have prevented Bobby's disappearance? But deep down, he knew. None of them could have predicted what happened. It wasn't negligence, it wasn't recklessness, it was simply a cruel twist of fate. Bobby's eldest brother, Ted, often found himself lost in thought, wondering if Bobby was still out there somewhere. He entertained the possibility that his brother had been taken, raised by another family, living under a different name, unaware of the life stolen from him. It was an impossible thought, but one he clung to because the alternative was too devastating to accept. Though the Panknan family never stopped loving the outdoors, they never returned to Deep Lake. The place that once held laughter and togetherness now carried the weight of an unbearable loss. Still, Bobby's memory remained with them, woven into every story, every photograph, and every whispered wish for a different ending. To this day, Bobby's disappearance remains one of Washington's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. No body, no evidence, no closure. Just a young boy who stepped into the woods and was never seen again. In 2017, 22-year-old Jesse Clint Galganov had the world at his feet. A brilliant student, he had just graduated from Wesleyan University in Connecticut with a perfect 4.0 GPA. He was set to attend medical school but decided to take an 8-month adventure through South America and Asia before committing to his studies. His journey began on September 24th, when he flew from Montreal to Lima, Peru. After spending a few days exploring the city and staying at the Loki hostel, Jesse boarded an 8-hour overnight bus to Huaraz, arriving on September 28th. He checked into a backpacker hostel and spent the day preparing for a 4-day trek along the Santa Cruz Trail. Before setting off, he informed his mother that he might be out of contact for a few days. On September 30th, Jesse began his hike as planned. By the evening, he had reached the Tuctupampa camp, where he shared a campsite with 2 French hikers. They later described his behavior as concerning. He seemed disoriented, complained of headaches and diarrhea, and mentioned getting lost. However, by the next morning, Jesse appeared to be in better spirits, and they all had breakfast together before he continued on his journey. The last confirmed sighting of Jesse was on October 1st, when he met a Czech hiking group near the Punta Union Pass and asked them for water. After that, he disappeared without a trace. At first, his mother wasn't alarmed when he failed to check in after his 4-day hike. She assumed he might have extended his trek. But as days passed with no word, her worry turned to panic. Desperate for information, she reached out to his friends on Facebook. Only one responded, saying they had last spoken to Jesse on September 29th. With growing fear, Jesse's mother filed a missing persons report on October 14th. She contacted embassies in Peru, the US, and Canada, hoping for assistance. But the investigation hit roadblocks. The owner of the hostel where Jesse had supposedly stayed denied he had ever checked in. Local muleteers, who frequently traveled the trails, refused to speak to authorities, fearing they would be blamed for his disappearance. Determined to find their son, Jesse's parents took matters into their own hands. They flew to Peru, walked the trail where he was last seen, and hired a private Israeli search and rescue team. They spent over $1 million on the search, raising funds through donations and a GoFundMe campaign. To encourage leads, Jesse's parents offered increasing cash rewards, first $10,000, then $30,000, and eventually a staggering $500,000, but no solid information ever emerged. Several theories surfaced. His parents suspected he had been kidnapped for forced labor by a cartel, which fueled their belief that offering money might lead to answers. Others speculated that he had fallen victim to acute altitude sickness, wandered off, and perished in the wilderness. But without any evidence, both theories remained unproven. In honor of their son, Jesse's father launched JesseProtected.com, a website dedicated to raising awareness about missing persons and providing resources for families facing similar tragedies. To this day, Jesse Galganov's fate remains a chilling mystery, leaving his loved ones searching for answers that may never come. On June 12, 1972, Holmes Lake in Calabogie, Ontario, was the perfect setting for a peaceful family fishing trip. 5-year-old Adrien McNaughton, a bright-eyed boy with blonde hair, joined his father Murray, 3 siblings, and a family friend for a quiet afternoon by the water. But by nightfall, their outing would turn into one of Canada's most haunting mysteries. Adrien quickly grew bored of fishing. Frustrated, he handed his tangled fishing rod to his father. It should have been an uneventful moment, but then he was gone. No scream, no splash, no sign of distress. One second he was there, the next he had vanished. Confusion turned to panic. Murray assumed Adrien had wandered to the car and sent his eldest son, Lee, to check. But when Lee returned without him, the search began. The once peaceful lake was now a scene of chaos. Family and friends called Adrien's name, scouring the woods for any sign of him, but there was nothing. As darkness fell, fear settled in. Adrien wasn't just lost, he had disappeared. The next day, authorities launched an extensive search. The Ontario Provincial Police, OPP, thousands of volunteers, and even the Canadian forces joined the effort. Over 150 square kilometers of rugged terrain were combed. Helicopters flew overhead, divers explored the lake, and search dogs sniffed through the dense forest. For 12 days, they searched relentlessly, yet not a single clue surfaced. No footprints, no clothing, no evidence he had been there at all. Speculation spread quickly. Some believed Adrien was taken by a wild animal. Others pointed to a suspicious black and white vehicle spotted nearby. Could he have been abducted? Theories of foul play only deepened the mystery. As the search expanded, Adrien's family clung to hope. His mother, Barbara, believed he could have been taken by someone desperate for a child. The thought of him alive, growing up elsewhere, was easier to bear than the alternative. Years passed, but Adrien's story never faded. In 2009, forensic artists created an age-enhanced image showing what he might look like in his 40s. The OPP released it, hoping someone would recognize his face. Was Adrien out there, living a life he didn't remember? In 2016, his case gained new attention through Someone Knows Something, a podcast hosted by Canadian filmmaker David Ridgen. The show re-examined evidence, explored new leads, and reignited public interest. Could modern technology finally solve the mystery? In 2018, investigators returned to Holmes Lake with new tools. A team drilled into the frozen surface, extracting sediment samples. Cadaver dogs, trained to detect human remains, signaled 2 samples, suggesting something or someone could be buried beneath. But the lake held on to its secrets. Poor visibility and thick sediment made further investigation impossible. The findings were intriguing, but not conclusive. Adrien's whereabouts remained unknown. Adrien McNaughton's disappearance is more than an unsolved case. It's a ghost story that lingers in the minds of all who hear it. His family, his community, and even strangers continue to wonder, what really happened that day? For some, he was simply lost to the wilderness. For others, the case is riddled with sinister possibilities. But one thing is certain, until answers surface, the mystery of Adrien McNaughton will continue to haunt Holmes Lake and the memories of those who remember the day he vanished. On March 3, 2023, Latavia T. McGee, a 33-year-old mother of 6, traveled to Matamoros, Mexico for a tummy tuck procedure, accompanied by 3 close friends, Eric James Williams, Shahid Woodard, and Zindel Brown. The group, from South Carolina, rented a white minivan for the trip, unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. Around 11:45 a.m. on March 3rd, their routine journey took a horrific turn. Gunmen, believed to be members of the Gulf Cartel, pulled up beside them on the streets of Matamoros. Without warning, they opened fire. Brown and Woodard were struck, while McGee, desperate to protect herself, was confronted by one of the attackers. Williams, too, was shot and trying to flee. The gunman, thinking the group was involved in smuggling, seized the friends, forcing them into their vehicle. What followed was a nightmare few could endure. A bystander captured the horrific abduction on video, and it quickly spread across the internet. Woodard, gravely injured, turned to his friends and told them he loved them. As McGee held back tears, she could only apologize, knowing their fate was slipping away. The group was transported to a remote location where McGee and Williams were held captive, their friends, Brown and Woodard, dead. McGee, in her desperation, asked to see the footage of their kidnapping. A guard showed it to her, further deepening her fear that their families would never know the truth. In a twist of fate, a man who had once been their captor turned into a reluctant savior. This man, an American himself, pleaded with his superiors to release McGee and Williams. He warned them that once they were freed, he would have to flee too. Blindfolded, the 2 survivors were transported through the night, hidden under bodies to avoid detection. After hours of evading authorities, they were finally freed by Mexican authorities, acting on a tip-off. In the cold, early hours of the morning, they were found, but the joy of survival was tempered by the loss of their friends. The kidnapping, broadcasted across the world, sent shockwaves through the public. For McGee and Williams, it was a trauma they would never forget. But the nightmare didn't end with their rescue. The cartel's mistake had led to the tragic deaths of 2 innocent men, Shahid Woodard and Zindel Brown, and the ripple effect of their loss was felt across the globe. Authorities later discovered the cartel had mistaken the group for Haitian smugglers, a deadly error that led to devastating consequences. In response, both U.S. and Mexican authorities launched a massive investigation, while the White House condemned the violence. Calls for military intervention mounted, but the pain of the families was undeniable. Woodard's family, still reeling from his brutal death, would soon mark his 34th birthday with a heavy heart. The kidnapping also sparked wider concerns about safety in Mexico. The U.S. State Department had issued a Level 4 advisory for Tamaulipas, where Matamoros is located, citing the dangers of cartel violence, kidnappings, and murder. Yet, despite the warnings, many still traveled to Mexico for affordable medical procedures, as McGee had in years past. This time, however, tragedy struck. While McGee and Williams continued to recover from their physical and emotional wounds, the families of the two men lost in the ordeal are left with a gaping hole that can never be filled. The victims' deaths were not just another statistic in a region plagued by violence. They were people with families and futures whose lives were cruelly snatched away in an instant. It was December 21st, 2013, a cold, crisp winter morning, the kind of day where frost lingers on the grass and the air is sharp with the promise of snow. Simon Hodgson, a 48-year-old man from Rickall, North Yorkshire, pulled on his coat, grabbed his binoculars, and prepared for what should have been an ordinary day. A devoted birdwatcher, Simon had spent years exploring the Yorkshire coast, drawn to its rugged beauty and the thrill of spotting rare avian life. Today, his destination was Bempton Cliffs, a nature reserve near Bridlington that had become his sanctuary over the years. As he drove his camper van toward the reserve, the excitement built within him. The familiar journey brought a sense of comfort, each turn of the road a well-worn path in his routine. When he finally arrived, he parked in his usual spot, overlooking the vast expanse of the sea. The cliffs stood tall and unyielding, their rocky faces adorned with nesting seabirds. The calls of kittiwakes and the distant cry of gulls filled the air, a symphony of the wild that Simon cherished. Stepping out into the brisk air, he inhaled deeply, feeling at peace. The world felt quiet, except for the sounds of nature. He slung his binoculars around his neck and set off along the cliffside paths, eager to lose himself in the tranquility of birdwatching. Hours passed as he observed the graceful flight of birds against the endless sky, jotting down notes in his worn field guide. It was moments like these that made him feel most alive. But as the afternoon waned, Simon knew it was time to head home. He retraced his steps toward his camper van, his heart full, his body pleasantly exhausted. He had seen everything he had hoped to, maybe even more. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting golden hues across the cliffs, and the wind whispered through the sparse grass as if bidding him farewell. Then, Simon vanished. That evening, when his family didn't hear from him, they grew concerned. It was unlike him to go silent, especially after a day spent doing what he loved. They called his phone, no answer. As hours passed, their worry turned into dread. By morning, their worst fears seemed to take shape. Simon's camper van was still in the same spot at the reserve, discovered by an RSPB staff member. The vehicle was untouched. Inside, his birdwatching books and binoculars lay neatly as if waiting for his return. But Simon was nowhere to be found. His family, friends, and local authorities launched an immediate search. Teams combed the cliffs, calling his name, scanning every crevice and path he might have wandered onto. Drones and rescue teams scoured the area, but there was no trace of him, no footprints leading away, no discarded belongings, no clues to follow. It was as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. Theories quickly emerged. Some believed Simon had fallen from the cliffs, his body carried away by the relentless tide. Others suggested he might have chosen to vanish intentionally, seeking solitude and escape from life's pressures. But those who knew him best struggled to believe he would walk away from the life he loved so dearly. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and then years. With no new leads, no sightings, and no remains ever discovered, Simon's case faded into an eerie mystery, leaving his family in agonizing limbo. The absence of answers was a wound that never quite healed. As each December 21st came and went, his loved ones gathered at Bempton Cliffs, standing on the same windswept paths where Simon was last seen. They held vigils, whispered prayers into the salty air, and vowed never to stop searching for the truth. But as they gazed out over the cliffs, an unsettling thought lingered. What if Simon was still out there somewhere, waiting to be found? What if the answers were just beyond their reach, hidden in the depths of the unknown? And what if they would never know what truly happened to the man who vanished without a trace? On March 15, 2018, the Sharp family, a close-knit group from Creston, Iowa, set out for what they hoped would be a much-needed escape. Kevin Sharp, a well-respected stock car racer known as the Sharpshooter, was joined by his wife Amy, a compassionate and dedicated mother, and their 2 children, 12-year-old Sterling and 7-year-old Adriana. The family had rented a condo in Tulum, Mexico, and after a smooth journey from Iowa, they were ready for some much-needed rest and relaxation. But in just a matter of days, everything would spiral into an unimaginable tragedy. The Sharps were in high spirits when Amy texted her mother around 7 p.m. on March 14th, confirming their safe arrival. "We made it to our condo," she wrote, reassuring her family back home. The next day, everything took a turn. The family had planned to visit local attractions, take in the sights, and maybe even visit a water park. But then, around 5 p.m. on March 15th, Kevin sent a message to his friend Travis Anderson. It would be the last communication anyone would hear from the Sharps. By March 21st, the family was expected to return home, first to St. Louis, then on to Danville, Illinois for a college basketball game. But when they didn't show, the silence was deafening. The worry set in, and by the early hours of March 22nd, the Sharp family was officially reported missing. Friends and family flooded social media with appeals for help, desperate for answers. As the hours ticked by, anxiety gripped everyone who knew them. The authorities launched an investigation, and their phones were traced to Tulum, but there was no sign of movement. Then, late on March 22nd, a discovery no one could have prepared for. Employees at the condo complex began to notice a strange, foul odor coming from the Sharps unit. Concerned, they entered, and what they found stopped them cold. The Sharps were dead. Kevin, Amy, Sterling, and Adriana, all of them, but there was no sign of foul play. The Mexican authorities, alongside the U.S. State Department, confirmed the unthinkable. The cause of death was asphyxiation due to a malfunctioning water heater. A tragic accident, but a chilling one. A gas leak in a poorly maintained unit took the lives of an entire family, and it left the town of Creston reeling. Kevin, known for his racing triumphs and community involvement, would never cross the finish line again. Amy, a beacon of kindness, was gone, as were Sterling and Adriana. Their bright spirits extinguished too soon. The family's death left a gaping hole, but it also raised urgent questions about tourist safety in Mexico. Despite the deaths not being related to violent crime, the shadows of rising violence and crime rates in regions like Tulum were impossible to ignore. A U.S. State Department advisory had warned of increased crime in Quintana Roo, where Tulum is located. Yet, tragically, the Sharp family's deaths only added to the growing concern for American tourists. As the community mourned the loss, others took to social media to share their support for the grieving families. Messages flooded in, but no amount of words could fill the void left behind by the loss of a mother, father, and 2 children. The Sharp family's tragic death served as a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of the dangers that can lurk just out of sight. 12-year-old Garrett Barsley was an adventurous boy from Summit County, Utah. With his light brown hair, hazel eyes, and a bright smile, he loved the outdoors. As a dedicated Boy Scout, he spent countless weekends hiking and camping in Utah's wilderness. On August 20th, 2004, Garrett joined his father, Kevin, and fellow scouts for a trip to Kuberant Lake in the Winta Mountains. The area, surrounded by tall trees and clear water, was the perfect spot for an adventure. Garrett was especially excited to fish with his dad, something they both loved. As they stood by the lake, casting their lines, Garrett's clothes became soaked. He laughed it off at first, but soon, the wet fabric grew uncomfortable. Deciding to change, he told his dad he was heading back to camp, a short walk away. Kevin watched as his son walked off, never imagining it would be the last time he saw him. When Kevin returned to camp, Garrett was nowhere to be found. He assumed his son had gotten distracted, but as the minutes passed with no sign of him, worry took hold. He called out, his voice echoing through the trees. Nothing. Kevin searched the area frantically, questioning the other scouts, but no one had seen him. Panic set in. Hoping Garrett had wandered back to the lake, Kevin retraced his steps, but there was no sign of him. The troop quickly launched a search, scouring the area, calling his name. As darkness fell, flashlights flickered through the trees, but still, Garrett was missing. By morning, search teams arrived. Volunteers, professional rescuers, trained dogs, and helicopters covered miles of rugged terrain. Days turned into weeks, yet no trace of Garrett was ever found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Months passed, but his family refused to give up. They appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show, their voices trembling as they pleaded for answers. They spoke of Garrett's love for adventure, his dreams of becoming a missionary, and the unimaginable pain of not knowing. Theories swirled. Some believed he was attacked by a wild animal. Others thought he drowned or got lost. Some even whispered he had been abducted. But without evidence, his disappearance remained a haunting mystery. Despite their grief, Kevin and Heidi turned their pain into purpose. They traveled to Ecuador to build a school in Garrett's memory, hoping to create something positive from their tragedy. They spoke at schools and events, urging people to stay vigilant and never stop searching. As years passed, Garrett's face faded from missing posters, but his family never lost hope. They held on to their memories, cherishing the laughter and love he brought into their lives. We can't help but wonder, what if? What if he had stayed by the lake? What if he had never walked back alone? What if his family never had to endure the agony of uncertainty? But for now, those questions remain unanswered. All they can do is hope that one day the truth will finally come to light. In January 2024, Dakarai Earl Cobb arrived in Medellin, Colombia, looking for a place to stay while he searched for more permanent housing. He found a room in the Santa Lucia neighborhood, renting from a local family who agreed to let him stay for a month. The landlords later recalled that he mostly kept to himself and was not very social. He would greet them occasionally, but beyond that, he remained private. When his rental period ended in early February, the landlords knocked on his door to check in, but there was no response. They assumed he might have gone out and thought little of it. 2 days later, on February 5th, they returned, growing concerned after noticing that the room remained silent. Using their spare key, they let themselves in and made a grim discovery. Dakarai was dead on his bed. It was clear that he had been deceased for several days. Panicked, the landlords immediately called the authorities. Investigators arrived and examined the scene before transporting Dakarai's body for an autopsy. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear evidence of a struggle, and none of his belongings appeared to be stolen. Initially, some suspected that his death might have been the result of a robbery gone wrong, but after speaking with the other tenants in the building, the police ruled out theft as a motive. As the investigation unfolded, a disturbing realization emerged. Dakarai was not the only one to die under strange circumstances that week. In the span of just 4 days, 3 other individuals were found dead in different locations across Medellin. 2 of them had fallen from the upper floors of their residences under unexplained conditions, while the third was found lifeless in a hotel room, with no signs of violence or struggle. The similarities between these deaths raised unsettling questions. Were these cases somehow connected? Had these people fallen victim to something more sinister? News of the mysterious deaths quickly spread, creating fear among both locals and tourists. Medellin had worked hard to improve its reputation in recent years, welcoming more visitors and promoting itself as a safe and thriving city. But with 4 unexplained deaths in such a short time, people began to worry. As safety concerns grew, tourism in the city started to decline. In response, Medellin's safety secretary, Manuel Villa, addressed the situation publicly and announced new security measures. He stated that officials would be focusing on issues like human trafficking, drug-related crimes, and organized criminal activity, which he believed could be linked to these incidents. He also warned that while the city welcomed tourists, it would not tolerate criminal behavior. "We invite visitors to enjoy Medellin's culture, food, and business opportunities," he said, "but those who engage in illegal activities will face consequences. We will not allow anyone to put public safety at risk." Despite the increased attention on the case, no suspects were ever arrested in connection to Dakarai's death. Investigators were unable to determine if the 4 deaths were related or if they were simply a series of tragic coincidences. To this day, the circumstances surrounding Dakarai's death remain a mystery, leaving many to wonder if the truth will ever be uncovered. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park is a breathtaking place, but for one family, it became the setting of an unimaginable nightmare. Just 6 days shy of his 7th birthday, Dennis Lloyd Martin joined his family for a camping trip, an adventure meant to be filled with laughter and exploration. Instead, it became one of the most baffling missing person cases in history, one that remains unsolved more than 50 years later. Dennis, affectionately called Denny by his family, was small for his age but full of energy and resilience. On June 14, 1969, he hiked with his relatives from Russell Field to Spence Field, where they planned to meet up with more family. After lunch, the adults sat back to enjoy the view, while Dennis, his brother Doug, and 2 other boys ran off to play nearby. At some point, the boys huddled together, whispering their plan. The adults, watching from a distance, could tell what was coming: a prank. The boys would scatter and then jump out to surprise them. With a burst of excitement, the kids split up. Doug and the others ran south, while Dennis dashed north, disappearing into the brush. Moments later, the first group leaped out, shrieking with laughter. The adults chuckled, playing along, but then they noticed something. Dennis never emerged. At first, they assumed he was taking his time. His father, Bill Martin, called his name. Then his grandfather joined in. The calls became louder, more urgent. They scoured the nearby woods, expecting to find him crouched behind a tree, giggling at their concern. But there was no sign of Dennis. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, panic set in. Clyde Martin, Dennis's grandfather, set off for Cades Cove to find help, a grueling trek through the rugged terrain. Bill Martin sought assistance from a park naturalist, but nature had its own cruel timing. By nightfall, storm clouds rolled in, winds howled, thunder rumbled, and then came the rain, 3 inches in just a few hours. Trails turned to mud, washing away any trace of Dennis. With only the clothes on his back, no jacket, no hat, he was left alone in the wilderness as temperatures dropped into the 50s. By dawn, the search was in full swing. Park rangers, expert trackers, and volunteers combed the dense forests, calling his name. But the terrain was brutal. Steep slopes, thick brush, and tangled undergrowth slowed every step. Well-meaning volunteers complicated things, trampling potential evidence. Days stretched into weeks. Helicopters searched from above, dogs sniffed the ground, and thousands of man-hours were dedicated to finding the boy. But not a single clue surfaced. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, nothing. By June 25th, Dennis's devastated family returned home. 4 days later, the official search ended. Some refused to give up, continuing on their own, but the results remained the same. Dennis had vanished, as if swallowed by the mountains. What really happened? Some believe he wandered too far and succumbed to the elements. Others think a wild animal took him. But then, there's the most chilling theory. On the day Dennis disappeared, a family miles away reported something disturbing. While hiking near Rowan's Creek, they heard a loud, terrible scream. Moments later, they saw a large, disheveled man moving through the woods, seemingly hiding from view. Could Dennis have been abducted? To this day, no one knows for sure. The Great Smoky Mountains still hold their secrets, and Dennis Martin remains one of the most haunting missing persons cases of all time.